on. There are quite a few things that you may want some clarification on as we go through this morning's session. As we prepare for this one, what I'll do is just speak a little bit about those persons who will be involved in this session this morning. Mr. Scott Foote, he is the Managing Director of Phenomenati, and Scott has quite a range of professional certifications, but he's also a cyber executive and a board advisor as well. He's a senior executive and entrepreneur. He has more than 35 years of technology experience in cyber security and the broader software industry. He has an acute ability to understand and map business needs to models, architectures, and technologies. He's also the author and influential communicator, skilled at making the complex simple and the abstract concrete. And he's, as I said before, he's authored several thought-leading pieces on cyber security, from things like risk formula to the risk-based access control, and the cyber SA model of network, mission, and threat. And he's driven to bring order to chaos. And his leadership experience includes building and leading growth-dominated products and services teams, organizations, and startups from the tens to the 1000s. So Scott is a frequent speaker at industry events, and he's a member of several industry consortia. He sits on a number of advisory boards and has been a member of the board of directors for NSERS Inc., Axia Corporation, and quite a few more as well. So Scott, we want to thank you and welcome you to this morning's session. And then we'll highlight Mr. Steve Beer. He is the field CTO of the Americas for TrustWave. And Steve will give Steve the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about himself. And of course, we heard Edward Millington, who's the Managing Director and Principal Security Consultant of CariSec Global. And he is an information security and ICT telecoms veteran with over 2 years experience. He's directed organizations and by leading them in achievement of financial goals through strategic planning, designing, and solutions directions. He specializes in policy development, IT and security governance, information and cybersecurity risk management, enterprise defense and security, cybersecurity incident management, malware and attack technologies, and security operations. So without further ado this morning, to speak on the topic cyber risk for business leaders, which will run from now until around 10:50 a.m. So we've got quite a session, and it's going to give these gentlemen time to really dig into the meat and share some prime nuggets with us this morning on this session. So gentlemen, hand over to you, and without further ado.
All right, good morning, everyone. Glad to see that. 1 second, please. Glad to see everyone is here, and hopefully we can start to discuss cyber risk for business leaders. And it's going to be very important that at the board level, senior government officials can really understand where the responsibility of cybersecurity lies. And while IT may be somewhat responsible within the company at this present moment, we want to transfer the ideas that this responsibility is really at the board or at the highest level, setting the strategies that we can develop cybersecurity within the business.
Before we talk about the integration of cyber risks into the overall program, I think there is an important concept here, which we use a lot in business continuity, business resiliency, and certainly in the cybersecurity world, that's business impact analysis. And I don't have a slide built on business impact analysis, but the team that Steve referred to, those network engineers, we just assume they understand what are the most important technologies in the business as they enable the business. And often they don't have that contextual knowledge. And to Stefan's point, when we're looking for value from the technology, we need to understand what our dependencies are on those different systems, whether they're internal to our environment or whether they're provided to us by third parties, services, and external systems. Understanding our dependency, the criticality, and how we would survive breaches and attacks on those dependencies. That's critically important to guiding our investments, to knowing where the 20% that Stefan talked about, where should that 20% investment be made to maximize the burn down of risk. So business impact analysis, or sometimes you'll hear it called a BIA, I think it's fundamentally important to delivering on that contextual information that we all need. And I'll talk about how we translate using BIA into a board level discussion in a few minutes. But let me launch into a few slides here about what Edward has just talked about, some strategic guidance in terms of how do we inform our programs, not at the technology level, but at the add value to business level that we're all concerned about in the executive teams and in the boardroom. The first verb that I talk about is balancing the objectives of the business with our obligations. Objectives are usually explicit. We're trying to add revenue, we're expanding the business, we're adding to our market share. It's the obligations that often are not as visible. They're implicit. General counsel will know what they are, but more often than not, our own cybersecurity defenders may not understand the full spectrum of our obligations, the legal, the regulatory, the contractual, the ethical, et cetera. What are those obligations? Because when we have an event, it's the obligation or the violation of that obligation that impacts the business. The second verb I talk about is optimizing the risk taking. And I think Stefan was briefly referring to this earlier in terms of we're never going to burn risk down to zero. We may not want to. New business brings new opportunity. When we assess these new opportunities, and it may just be switching our financials books from Oracle NetSuite to Oracle Financials or SAP. But even a change like that brings with it risk, opportunity, but also risk. So how do we look at that business context, that BIA, to understand and expose the potential gains and losses in that new opportunity? We need to invest in the due diligence and due care. Those are primary terms for those of us that sit in boardrooms. That is our job as independent board observers or participants, to make sure that the company is making sufficient or reasonable investments in both due diligence, knowing ourselves and the threat landscape, and due care. Where do we make that 20% investment? BIA is fundamental to this optimizing of the risk acceptance. The third verb is to maximize trust in the brand. As Stefan has said, trust is a big word in the cybersecurity space. And depending upon who you are, trust is a very positive thing if you're looking at bringing in new opportunity from consumers or partners. You want to gain their trust and hold it. On the other side, trust is a negative thing. That's why we talk about zero trust. You might have heard that term in the press a lot. In terms of burning down risk, what we're doing is looking through our business impact analysis, understanding where our most critical infrastructure or third-party providers are, and reducing our trust in them. Whether it's through independent audits or continuous pen testing, we want to continuously test those trust levels to make sure these are trustworthy entities, but never trust blindly. That's where the term zero trust comes from. Never trust blindly. So these three verbs are critically important as we talk about the strategy for cybersecurity, not the technical implementation. Let's look a little bit now at what do we often do with the executive team and what I always do in the boardroom. Whether I'm on the executive team, I am a chief risk officer, I'm a CISO, I'm a data protection officer as well. When I'm on the executive team, I press them to take this view, but especially when I'm in the boardroom, to communicate with the board. The first question we ask is, what does success look like? You heard Charles mention in my intro that I focus a lot on bringing order to chaos. Well, success does not look like someone coming in and just briefing all the panic and concern and industry is bad and we have technology problems and somebody had a mouse moving on their computer. That's chaos. What we try to do is structure risk in terms of risk scenarios, concrete risk scenarios, not hundreds, but maybe 5 to 10 risk scenarios in a risk register. And these should be in business terminology. This is just an example. It's a real example of one that we've used that's been sanitized. But here is a risk, this first row across the top. It's a legal or reputational risk. That's the damage, potential damage to the business. We're worried about the threat, criminal threat of extortion. Someone steals our data and then they extort us, like you would see in a ransomware event. That's qualitatively, this metric just to the right is a 5. That's very high. On a scale of 1 to 5, we set it to 5. I'll come back to qualitative and quantitative in a minute. Then we have a very frank conversation, usually protected by counsel. What are our current vulnerabilities? Those could be our staff. They could be our processes. They're not always just technology. The fact that we don't have multi-factor authentication, that our backups aren't being tested, that we're not properly using encryption. But we do an inventory of those vulnerabilities and we assess them qualitatively. In this particular scenario, I assessed it as a 4 deliberately to push it up high, 4 on a scale of 5, where 5 is the worst. And then what are the consequences? If we have a privacy breach, what are the consequences to the business? Not to the data set or the computer or the database, but to the business. Will we lose the consumer trust that they've put in us? Will they even care? Will we wind up paying legal fees or regulatory fines? Will we wind up losing 10% of our revenue over the next 6 to 8 quarters because of that trust erosion? I've set that to be a 5 because this would be a fairly major event for someone that deals with a lot of privacy data. Then we can quantitatively assess it. Your insurance companies can help with this. We do a lot of this now when we're going into the boardroom, talk about a single loss expectancy, but how often would it happen? We annualize that. 0.25 is once every 4 years, just to give you some background on these numbers. So a $4 million event that is likely to happen once every 4 years to someone in our space produces a $1 million annualized event. What we're doing is we're taking an inventory of the risk scenario. What are our current vulnerabilities? How bad do we think it's going to be? We're qualitatively assessing it, then we're quantitatively assessing it to inform our decision making. If we were to spend an additional $100,000 on administrative, say, policy development, or maybe humans doing auditing, and then another $100,000 in technical controls, we annualize that to $200,000, balance the $200,000 cost against the qualitative and quantitative numbers. What you see on the far right is just a green cell, which suggests that the cost benefit analysis for this risk scenario is a positive one. I don't want to go into any more depth. I'm happy to chat about this another time if folks are interested, but the point is we've taken an inventory of the top risk scenarios. We've qualitatively assessed them in these red columns so that we can rack and stack them by priority. It's important that we know ourselves so we can understand not just the vulnerability, but the consequence. We've looked at this quantitatively so that we can assess whether spending another $500,000 or $3 million in controls is worth the effort. Spending $5 million in new technologies to burn down a $500,000 annualized risk does not sound like it's a reasonable investment in due care. We work with teams to understand. We work with the executive teams and the board so that they can agree that the risk that's being mitigated is appropriate and the risk that's being accepted or transferred is also appropriate based upon the objectives of the business. That's what we call risk level agreements. We want the board to be providing oversight along these critical risk scenarios. We want the board to drive the executive team to continually push down risk where it is considered to be unacceptable, where it's above a reasonable threshold. These risk level agreements, we press them even to become corporate documents. They're part of the board package. The feedback from the board is documented, so that if and when an event occurs and the company winds up being sued or investigated from a regulatory body, we can demonstrate the due diligence that was put into the investment in the controls. Risk level agreements are the way to take the technology out of the discussion and have a business level discussion with your board members. So how do we integrate that into broader risk management? Most of our boards are doing this anyway. Certainly our executive teams are doing this for things that aren't just cyber, but all risks to the business. That is our jobs. ISO 31000 presents a very good framework for this. I use it a lot. And that is for all risk. In my job as a chief risk officer, I focus not just on cyber risks, but on all risks to the enterprise. And we follow this general framework of these 7 basic steps. Looking at the context of the business, you heard me talk about what are our objectives versus our obligations. It is critically important to make sure these stay visible, that they're not implicit but explicit. We identify the risks every time we have a change or a new threat on the horizon. We assess it. You saw me do that qualitatively and quantitatively. Then we check to see whether we're comfortable accepting the risk, or do we need to further treat the risk, transfer to the insurance company, invest in more controls. We also want to make sure that we're continuously improving on our risk management program, because risk never ends. It's never zero, and new risks materialize all the time. The last point that's critical here when we integrate into overall risk management is to understand the culture of the business. Banks and insurance companies are typically very risk averse, as they should be. We all want them to be. Startups, though, in the software industry in particular, are typically very risk tolerant, where they accept risk and often they don't even know they're accepting it, but they press forward to get to market. Understanding the culture of the business is critical to being able to influence its risk management overall. Because if the humans don't adhere to the risk management program, they wind up very quickly being one of our weakest vulnerabilities. The last thing I want to talk about here is putting things into the general risk landscape. So anyone that's been in a boardroom has seen risk cubes or risk matrices before. This is a fairly familiar communication technique where we on the executive team will explain to the board, we've got 10 or 11 or 12 risks. Maybe it's in a risk register. I would hope it would be in a risk register, but they're laid out here in terms of likelihood on the vertical and impact on the horizontal. What we want to have in terms of the communication of risk management is how are we going to drive these risks down and to the left if we are not comfortable with where they are now. So that overall program begins by talking about recommended controls. We don't need to have an in-depth conversation about all the available controls, but it is important at the executive level we understand the range of controls. When the technologist brings it into the boardroom, they're going to be talking about administrative, physical, and technical controls. Those are types of controls. Administrative would be a policy or a procedure that we need to adhere to. Physical might be locks, might be closed circuit television or floor sweeps. Technical, that's what we all think of when we think of cyber. So your passwords, further authentication using multi-factor. But the other thing we need to think about in terms of controls is what are the objectives of the controls? Are they preventative? Are we trying to prevent the risk from materializing? Or are we trying to detect it should it materialize? And ultimately, to the resiliency topic that Stefan spoke about, are we trying to survive the risk when it does occur? That's the body of controls. And I find that instead of just showing up with a laundry list of things that I want to buy if I'm the CISO or the CIO, I show up with a plan that says I'm going to populate risks for defense in depth. And these are the things we need to do. Enhance our policies. We need to adapt to, better secure areas or kiosks for people that are accessing sensitive information. I lay out the plan in a control matrix like this, and then I explain, what am I trying to reduce? Am I trying to reduce the likelihood? Most controls do that. Some would argue that controls can only reduce likelihood. I don't agree. Some controls, like backup and encryption, they help us to reduce the impact should the event occur. So as I talk about these risks, I will explain to my board or my leadership, I'm going to burn this risk down. I'm going to burn it down with this particular approach, data minimization, data retention, reduction, periods. I will explain the control, but the purpose is to drive the risk down. Another one might be multi-factor authentication is going to help us with this particular risk. That would actually help with probably many risks. Still another one might be why I want immutable storage for my backup, or why I want to encrypt at the record level, not just the file level. All of these explanations, though, they all drive risk down, and the purpose is to take our residual risk, what is left over after we apply the controls, and get it below the tolerance of the organization. What does that tolerance look like? In most environments, people can't tell me. Until I give them a number, that number is 10.9 million Barbadian dollars. Until I put that number on the board, most organizations are not prepared to say, I'm comfortable or uncomfortable. But when I bring in a risk matrix and I say my residual risk, I'm only going to get down to 10.9, all my risk scenarios quantitatively add up to 10.9 million Barbadian dollars, that's when people get uncomfortable. That's when they can tell me you're not done yet. We need to continue to mitigate those risks, or that's an acceptable level given where we are. This draws us into the conversation about KPIs. So I'll put up a few KPIs just to be provocative here for a second. These are a few that I use. Oh, there we go. These are just illustrative to get a conversation started, but I always start my briefings with an inventory of the obligations the company has. Why? Because I'm trying to keep those obligations visible, not implicit, explicit. They're always growing. Then I talk about the objectives. In terms of new business opportunity, how many opportunities are showing up that have a dependency on our cybersecurity program? And what's the win-loss ratio? Are we winning more and more? Are we losing more and more of those new opportunities because of our risk posture, our cybersecurity program? In risk management, I talk a lot about where are we in terms of our risk reduction. That's a ratio. That residual risk I spoke about versus the inherent risk before we applied the controls. How much of our risk are we burning down? 80% of the risk, 90% of the risk, only 40% of the risk? That's an important number to track over time. The aggregate risk you saw on the bottom of my graph, that's a very, very important number because it's the one that makes people uncomfortable. But also the risk balance where you divide that by the risk tolerance. If we think our risk tolerance is 10 million Barbadian dollars, we're above the ratio of 1.0. That's where we begin to get uncomfortable, and we press our cybersecurity program to get back in to continue to mitigate those risks. These are just some of the examples of key performance indicators that need to be translated into the context of business. It can't be the number of incidents. It can't be the number of vulnerabilities. Those things are meaningful to us in the network engineering shop or the security ops center. They're not meaningful in the boardroom. They have no context in the boardroom. There are a few others down here in terms of risk matrix where are we in terms of maintaining our obligation to confidentiality or integrity, burning down fraud, for example, or just the availability of our services. These are all key to track over course of time. I've given some examples. These red numbers here are illustrative of a company that maybe has experienced a confidentiality breach, lost some records in Q1. In Q2, the same threat attacker was able to perpetrate fraud against the financial institution. In Q3, things got a lot worse and we had some downtime. The service lacked availability. Maybe it was ransomed and encrypted, but the service actually went offline for some number of hours. These are just illustrative examples, but these are the types of things that I will track for a program over the course of time because they're meaningful in the boardroom. So let me pass it back over here to Edward and the team. And again, this was meant to just be provocative and start the conversation.
Yeah, Scott, I think it's fantastic how it's actually presented, because usually right at the board level or at the top, they're not really interested in vulnerabilities and how those KPIs are actually generated, but how can we actually turn that into some form of risk that we can properly plan for. I'm not quite sure if the attendees might have any questions, but Steve and Stefan, from your view at this standpoint, what are really some of the concerns, especially when in today's age, in 2023, we still continue to see some large number of attacks. We continue to see some issues where cyber risk is not really fully understood, and you're still getting those breaches. You know, you might have strength in one area. Let's take, for instance, like LastPass, but somehow the endpoint was kind of weak. You know, so you put in all the security in one area, but sometimes the risk around employees, the risk around not testing applications well, having very strong phishing controls tend to creep in. So therefore, it means then that the top has not visualized or have a true aspect of the what we call the domain of security, or the domains of security, to really make sure that those areas are properly, risk managed.
So I'll dive in on that a little bit. So I think number one, this was fantastic, right? And so when we measure the business impact, right, of risk, it's for a lot of organizations, it's really hard, right? And so models like this exist to come back and think rationally about the business impact. And so I do some very similar exercises. I've used tools like FAIR, factor analysis of information risk. Those things deal with possibilities and probabilities that at least an organization can have a very thoughtful and engaging dialogue on what is the business impact, what is the financial impact when you start to measure things out, right? And so when I present on the economics of cybercrime tomorrow, that's one of the things I like to talk about as well. And I think organizations need to really measure the impact of cyber activity over the course of a total year to understand the real risk to a business. Look at parallel organizations, look at competitors, right? Look out there and come up with some really good assumptions about what that means to the business. Factoring in downtime, right? Business impact analysis, like how many days can we suffer, downtime is a place to start for sure. There are a lot of vendors out there as well that will say a dollar amount per record or per client record is a good place to start too. I really and truly think about the whole of cyber from an impact analysis perspective, in that organizations can be taken offline, sure, right? But their reputational impact, like Scott talked about, the downstream effect, measuring the consequences over the course of a larger period, like a year, I think is more fruitful for an organization to do as a wargaming exercise, to really to get a firm grasp on what they need to protect, and then correlate that back into the model, like Scott discussed, right? You're not going to burn down risk, or you shouldn't be burning down risk if the value of that target isn't appropriate, right? You should be burning down risk, and you should be integrating the proper countermeasures back into the business that help accelerate the business, right? And so that's the secret sauce, I think, that boards need to get their arms around and propel the organizations forward.
If I may jump in here, gentlemen, because I understand what you're talking about, this whole question of risk. One of the important things that you mentioned was the organization's culture. How do you get an organization to develop the kind of culture where the things that you mentioned in terms of the board paying attention to this program that Scott highlighted? How do you get an organization to develop the kind of culture that now takes this thing seriously and makes it a critical part of their operations? How do you go about doing that?
So I'll take that one very quickly. Just as a starting point, it sounds a bit trite, but in fact, in practice, this is the most effective way that I've seen. And that is to start with the top. Start with the leadership, adopting a sense of risk and acknowledging it in their communication to the staff. Too often, I see leadership teams, more so on the technology vendor side, but I see the leadership teams that will say, we want to have all these controls. We want a strong program. We want ISO 27000 compliance. We want SOC 2 audit reports. Just don't apply the controls to me. I want exceptions. I need to be able to have exceptions where the rest of the staff can't. That's the anti-culture. That starts from the top. So if you don't have that message that is continually sustained, not just once and done or annual, but continually sustained from the leadership team in everything that they do, you won't make an effective change in your culture. Starting at the bottom and training as you go up, that is a good and useful thing. But without the reinforcement of leadership, you'll find that it just trails off over time. The training is forgotten before they go through the next annual training, and we still have people clicking on links or, asking for exceptions to policies. But I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks.
I think you're spot on. I think you've got to lead by example, and then push that down to the troops. So many times we see organizations, Cybersecurity Awareness Month is October, right? Come November, they've forgotten everything, right? And so pushing forward, towing the line from the top down, and then perhaps even gamifying, if you will, the cyber as a whole to the organization, right? When somebody does something right, reward them, right? Do those phishing campaigns throughout the year, right? Do those things that are impactful to them. And then there are two other notions that I think are very critical with organizations in embodying that risk culture throughout their employee landscape is number one, make it part of their daily lives. So not only educate your employees, your board members, your executive teams, and so on, about cybersecurity, but help them understand the elements of cybersecurity back to their own daily lives so that they become ambassadors of security, if you will, right? So let them go home and teach their spouse or their children about what good cyber hygiene is, what is good security policy, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should with a lot of applications today. Like, get them to start to think about security in a broader sense that impacts their daily lives. And certainly it translates into the business, right? And then last but not least, right, pride of ownership, right? Pride of ownership, I think, is a critical a critical culture element, and that we're proud of what we do, and being proud of what we do means that we're secure in what we do, right? And then that will, I think, pay dividends forward for a lot of organizations today.
Risk consciousness. I love the risk consciousness word in the boardroom. Certainly with the executive team, but in the boardroom. When we go in and say we need money for security awareness training, they say, don't we have enough modules? Hasn't everybody complied and taken their training modules? Yeah, that security awareness is not something that lasts, as we talked about, especially if you're only doing it on an annual basis. But Steve talked about make it part of every day, make it part of what you do every day. That gets to that risk consciousness that Stefan talked about. We want people to consider risk in any of the high-risk decisions they make in their day-to-day job. We want all of our staff, not just the customer-facing staff, but everyone, to be conscious of the risk. We're not saying you always need to say no in the decision. We're simply saying, when you say yes, be responsible. As you make your decisions, be conscious of the risk that you're accepting or that you're entering into. So it's a very different view. Too often it's just security awareness training and it's dismissed. Check the box, we spent the money, everyone's compliant. I'd much rather see the risk consciousness going on, like when I show up at a client and someone doesn't recognize me, but they see me in a suit, they say, oh, I must be an executive, so they let me follow them through without badging in or challenging me on who I am. That's not very risk conscious.
No,
that gets back to building that culture.
So Scott, then the main question is that how do you then create this risk consciousness? Because unlike in some other parts of the world where business owners, boards, and so forth are now being forced to have not only a seat at the table, but also have an understanding of cybersecurity, I think the fear really is that board members, chairmen, etc., believe that it is something very complex and they don't have the time to draw on that awareness. In everyone's experience here, how have you seen that movement? Because it's okay to be forced by compliance. You might tick a box or you might try to get actively involved. But as you know, when something is not fully supported, it's going to die before it even starts. So therefore, how are you seeing that slow learning where business leaders are now slowly taking interest? What are some of the stepping stones that you can say that they can literally start to take interest? Because threats. We're seeing media presentations of all these breaches, all of these outages, shutdowns, and so forth, but it doesn't seem to be changing business. I bet even though you can go to maybe company N, a massive company, and say, okay, then how is the cybersecurity? You're gonna hear great. And then in the next 2 weeks, you hear it happen. So what are you seeing?
Parents' generation finally understand what we do for a living, right? And but I think it's very important that we as security practitioners, right, continue to educate, because education, I think, is, and we all need to become students of cyber to understand the impacts of cyber to our businesses. You know, I love the compliance talk track in that compliance is not necessarily secure, and secure is not necessarily compliant. And organizations that adopt a strategy of just compliance will learn, because organizations that do get hit, that are technically compliant, do get hit, and the bad guy just needs to be above that compliance threshold, right? And to start to practice, you know, and have that risk analysis, have that understanding, have that education of what the art of the possible is, and what the cyber element is doing continuously to evolve their tradecraft to get above, you know, your controls and compromise your environment. So,
and if I want to pile on to both Stefan and Stephen's comments here, but one of the things that I typically do when we talk about how do we improve culture, again, in the executive, you know, team, amongst ourselves, but also with the board, is the first thing I remind people is that culture is not just specific to cyber. Culture is part of every company. Think about some of the brands that stand out for you and why. Is it because their service is terrific? We have a fast food chain here in the United States called Chick-fil-A. And I have a friend who was going for their MBA, and she was doing a business case on them. And she talked about how they changed their culture fundamentally to improve their service just by being polite, regardless of the circumstance, just by making sure that everyone who's customer facing is polite. Then as they deal with each other, that they always say please and thank you. There are never any expectations or entitlements. Everyone enforces and reinforces polite behavior because it's part of their brand, it's part of their culture. The same is true, as Steve just pointed out, the same is very true if we want people to think about the risk consciousness and we want to improve that, then we need to reinforce it. We need to make it a positive thing when people make decisions that incorporate a risk calculus. At any level of the business, they need to understand that they do have the ability to make a decision, but they have the responsibility to make that decision wisely, to make an informed decision that considers the potential risk to the business. So that reinforcement, I think the training is part of it. Communications is fundamental. And as we said before, it needs to come from the top. If the top ignores it, eventually the staff will ignore it as well. Right. But culture is, any attribute of culture, not just cyber, needs to be continuously reinforced if it's going to survive.
Well, I think it's one of the situations where advisory support, consulting support is really definitely needed at the top. I mean, we just ran a very small poll. We had 36% participant reply, 65% no advisory needed at this present moment. So I think sometimes those types of minor polls or minor queries can be very concerning, especially when the top experts that down bottom know what is really going on. And again, as you, Scott, and Stefan would have mentioned, and also Steve, you're going to have a lack of resources, a lack of knowledge, skills, etc. So I really do hope that before this session comes to an end, that many business owners and leaders, those who are at the strategic level, really do take away from this event that this is a general problem globally. We really need for the top to really understand cyber. Reach out, ask some questions. We have Scott here, myself. We also have Steve here. Our partner, TrustWave, wonderful, beautiful partner, global number 7 in the world right now. We are here to help you with some of those terminologies, those knowledge. Scott presentation, I think, just touches that view that is very important, because we understand you're spending a lot of money. You know, I don't want to laugh at it, but a lot of money is being spent, but yet, you know, somehow it seems that we're not getting it. And when we do look at the bigger companies or organizations or even governments being hacked, one would think, you know, what can we do? You know, like for instance, here in the Caribbean, Scott, Stefan, Steve, a large company is tens of thousands or maybe close to 100,000 people. A large company here in Barbados, maybe about 500, 600 employees the most. Small could be about 10, 12, maybe 20. Medium is somewhere up to about 100. So we have those situations where when you look at the ergonomics, you're thinking, how can I fight this global battle when larger companies are really failing? But when you have that discussion with them, you realize that there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of transfer of risk, as you know, we call it in our field. Instead of transferring it to maybe some entity that can manage it well, we transfer it to maybe IT, and then say to them, you have this budget, you have this IT budget, but in this IT budget, it encompasses cybersecurity, when it's two different things, you know, and IT security is not cybersecurity. So I think there has to be quite a bit of takeaway from here to business owners, you know, leaders, governments, and government officials, that when we, let's call it a program, when we implement our services, you know, within that project program, regardless if it's a application that goes on your phone that allow us to transact business correctly, order online, make a payment, whatever that situation is, you have to understand that there's a risk. And simply, let's say, perform a pen test. Simply just saying, someone say, well, our servers are good. Our servers may be good this very second. Steve can talk to you about this. And within a couple of seconds to minutes, hours, days, there is a vulnerability within the infrastructure. The security culture might not be great. So you send your employees through quite a bit of training, but over a short period of time, you know, that risky behavior comes back. You have endpoints that are not fully updated or taken offline. You have, let's say, developers pulling code from open source code from all over the internet, and those modules, especially, you know, Linux, are highly being attacked right now. You know, back in the old days, we can almost guarantee that once we run a Linux machine or certain architectures, we are safe. That is not the case anymore. So therefore, the applications need to be constantly tested. Yes, we know it's very expensive to run a penetration test on almost every variant of an application or deployment. But once we start to understand that risk, we can start to create the budgets around it. We can start prioritizing that risk a lot more easy. As Scott mentioned, Stefan mentioned, Steve also mentioned, you have to prioritize that risk as much as possible. So I don't know if any other additional takeaways that you can give the other attendees here, but I guess they will welcome it. We may have one question, but
Edward,
go ahead.
I wanted to back up to a comment you made a few minutes ago on the transferring of risk. This comes up very often with executive teams typically, and occasionally in the boardroom. Why are we spending this money on new controls? Can our insurance company just cover it? That's a request to transfer the risk to the insurance underwriter. If that scenario in my risk register, if that scenario materializes, can't we just be made whole by the insurance company? 10 years ago, that may have been true. Insurance companies are not willing to underwrite a lot of the risks in your risk register. And insurance companies today, the underwriters now, they want to know about your cybersecurity program. They want to understand your controls. They want to see your risk register and understand what risk are you driving down? What are you addressing? And what risk are you? Exactly. They want to see what is the residual risk and where do you expect them to help with the residual risk? Do you expect them, if you're carrying a $5 million Barbadian dollar policy, do you expect them to make you whole for what type of a risk? First party data breach, third party data breach? And what are the payments that they're making for that? That conversation or assumption from 10 years ago that the insurance company will fix everything, they'll just cover our costs and we can continue to operate, that is no longer true.
Scott, would you remember, I think it was November, December, where a lot of, especially Lloyd's first came up with it, I think it was Lloyd's, where they highlighted that many of the insurances did not want to underwrite, especially businesses that possibly can have a breach. So you have a situation where before 2020, 2021, you could have a breach and insurance are willing to pay for it. Now, because of some statements, and especially since the Ukrainian-Russian war, nation state, quote unquote, how do you detect it? Because every threat, if you revert back, you go back to that threat, you can see it coming from out of, let's say, Ukraine or Russia or some other, China or something like that. So is that classified as a nation state attack? Is that mean that I may not be covered? So therefore, it's very important for businesses in 2023 as this global war, this global cyber war heats up. And it may not be a simple thing as denial of service, which can take your service down. The worst part of it is when you start having compliance risks. And when we talk about compliance risks, you have the data protection. You may be part of PCI. You may be some other form of compliance due to your operation. So you might have a situation where you have multiple compliance risks, which are possibly buying fines. Then comes along, you have then other legal risks. You have some civil lawsuits and so forth. So these are some of the things that within the region, the Caribbean region and beyond, have to start looking at, because they are going to pull up. They are going to, this have to be board awareness. This can't be middle management or bottom what we call technology responsibility. These types of risks is going to come back to the top. They're going to put a dent into your budgets and possibly, those little dividends and so forth you have from other businesses. But the fact is how to remain very quote unquote, and I use the word compliant because I don't want to say once you're compliant, you're good. Because as I think Scott or Steve mentioned, you can be compliant, but compliance only covers a certain number of security controls, and some of them are different maturity levels that which we will discuss tomorrow. So you're going to find an adversary is going to look and see what you're being compliant with and try to get into those gaps. It's very important. So being compliant doesn't mean you're secure. So the aim is to have a full capacity for cyber resilience, to make sure that every single security domain, which we would highlight later on, which is tomorrow, those areas are very strong, so that when you look at that risk overall, there's no gaps. There's no gaps within your business because it must match your business. Company X and company Y have different risks, have maybe different security controls, as Stefan mentioned, Scott also mentioned. You're not going to put in a $5 million control for something only worth 5,000 when the impact is small, the vulnerability is small, threat is small. It doesn't worth it. That let's say that, who knows, $4 million could be go to something else to better protect your company, even including training. Anything else, good gentlemen, as we come close to our closing? That is correct, especially if you look and see the main entries of where threats come through is going to be phishing. So really secure your email, use services maybe like Microsoft, Google with the extra advanced security. That's one point. Reiterating, a good endpoint security solution. There's some solutions that start at a minimum of 10. The enterprise ones are a lot more higher. So unfortunately, if you have a small business, less than 50, maybe 20 or 12, here in the Caribbean and some parts of the world, that is, kind of prohibited to buy maybe 100 licenses or 200 licenses in minimum. And risk awareness, as Stefan and Scott mentioned, understanding the risks of what you click on, where you go, leaving the machine turned on, where you actually, and one thing that we haven't really mentioned that much here, which we try to keep it secure, but opening your laptop, going on public wireless, very dangerous. Unless you have a particular solution that allow you to use maybe VPN into a secure environment, like a service, etc., it is not good. So keeping your systems up to date, etc., are some of the minor things. And again, we are all here to ask those particular questions. They don't want to get too technical today, but again, your safety, especially at start, setting that culture for everyone within the team or within the organization is going to be very important. Very important. So gentlemen, thank you very much. Just had to extend the period a little bit more so we don't terminate the link. I really appreciate the comments that you have made today. I'm hoping that the attendees have made a lot of notes and they'll be able to take that away and also reach out to us to be able to start that venture of cyber advisory. It is very much needed in businesses today. And I can say we in the Caribbean are at the point of exploding in the digital transformation realm. So being able to deploy, even governments being able to deploy, many services as safe as much as possible is going to be critical. Any last comments?
Thank you, Edward and Charles, for moderating. Appreciate the invitation, and I hope folks enjoy the rest of the sessions today and tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. And for the participants, just be mindful that our next session starts at 11 a.m. So we're going to have a short break and we'll be back at 11 a.m. to discuss the strategic response to cyber attacks. So we just look forward to seeing you at our next session in about another 7 or so minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.